Hello, I'd like to welcome you all to our conference. I will now introduce Dr. Moshe Behar. Moshe Behar holds a PhD from Columbia University in New York and is senior lecturer and program director of Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Manchester. His work includes the anthology, Modern Middle Eastern Jewish Thought, Writings on Identity, Politics and Culture, 1893 to 1958. He will be today addressing the question, is the notion of historical contingency lost on Palestine studies of pre-1948? And without further ado, I'd like to now hand over to Dr. Behar.
All right. Hi, if you hear me, I can't start the video because it's locked somehow. So I don't know if that's fine. Should I simply share the screen?
Yes, please, if it will let you.
Okay.
If not, I'll have to see why it's not working.
No problem. Okay, let me share my screen. All right, can you see? Can you hear me? See me?
I can see it, yes.
All right, because no problem. I just see my own screen and that's it. But that's fine. I mean, I am not sure what I'm supposed to see and whether people are supposed to see me or no. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Sorry, I'm going to share my screen again. Here we are. Great. Hopefully it works now, right? How do I remove this? Great. All right, just let me know when you want me to start. Thank you so much.
You can start whenever you're ready. We're ready now.
All right, thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Josh, for all the hard labor of you and your team. And also thank you, of course, for James, who invited me. I think you're doing great work, and I'm quite impressed that undergraduates, if you are undergraduates, I mean, doing such a project, it's really, I think, unusual during the 15 or 16 years that I'm teaching in the UK. So kudos to you. Right, so the other thing is that I assume that there's going to be a variety of people attending, from even maybe year one students, maybe my students, some of them may wish to join, and then also some professors. So I try to tailor the presentation to hopefully will be comprehensible by all of this range. Right, so the title is The Notion of Historical Contingency Lost on Palestine Studies. I said Palestine-Israel Studies because the principal question that I'm asking here, I think, prevails also after the conclusion of the British mandate over Palestine. So the question that I'm raising does not stop in some respects in 1947 or 1948, but given the fact that we are speaking about the mandate, probably we are discussing Palestine studies because the state of Israel is not there, and its establishment marks the end in some respects of the period we are studying. And the other thing, Josh, if you can just, you can stop me 10 minutes before the hour if I somehow speak too much, which can happen. So maybe we can get some questions or no. Right, so let me just try to, here we are. Okay, so few opening words. I arrived at the study of mandatory Palestine and also after mandatory Palestine from the discipline of comparative politics. Now, as such, as someone that comes from comparative politics, I think I'm a member of a rather small minority community within the study of the mandate, and ordinarily I'm surrounded by a majoritarian ocean of historians because the people that are dominant in this the domain of the study of mandate tend to be historians. But the disciplinary, there is a disciplinary difference, and I also, of course, read the syllabus of the course, and in some respects, it's the course that you students studied is a history course. So let me just say a few words about my approach to the period. Comparativists, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, we are commonly interested in the whole forest rather than a single tree or single trees. So for example, here we see a map that includes the territory that did comprise before 1948 mandatory Palestine, but it is just a small part of, for example, the greater Middle East. I come from the Department of Middle Eastern Studies and Arabic Studies. So of course, when we approach the question of the mandate, ordinarily we try to understand it vis-a-vis other parts of the Middle East. So that's just one illustration. More about comparativists. I think that we are not too shy of transitioning between pre and post 1948. Sometimes historians are wary of this. They say that we do it too hastily, and it's not, that it can even be maybe not responsible enough, so to speak, from the perspective of historians. And I would even say that sometimes we even transition between entire centuries. And I want to quickly illustrate that because I think this dominates what I'm going to say next year. For example, right, I am of the view, right, that a thorough understanding of the 1939 White Paper and the 1947 UNSCOP Minority Plan, the minority plan that was submitted to the General Assembly of the United Nations, is absolutely essential for the possibility for anyone to comprehend our very present. So for example, students, if you did your work, right, and you, in my understanding, fully understand what happened around the year 1939 and 1947, I think that this will enable you to understand properly also what is going on today, nearly 100 years later, 90 years later. So that's cool. And this is in a way a transition between centuries, which is something that doesn't happen, cannot happen too lightly. Let me give another illustration. For example, sometimes we can borrow a 21st century terminology to try and understand actions by the League of Nations after 1999. So for example, nowadays, there's a big discussion about one state, two state solution. And these people that study Palestine, Israel know that this is a major component of the discussion over the period. So sometimes I can say, if you want to understand the League of Nations actions with the terminology of today, why don't we speak about a post-1919 four-state solution and then a post-1922 five-state solution? And what do I mean by that? I mean that I hope that you properly know the map. The area that is circulated with red line is the area whereby the League of Nations decided to apply a mandate system, unlike, for example, in Egypt or in Yemen or in Aden, where it was a protectorate, or Algeria was a full colony, and there are also condominium, all kinds of institutional linkages between the European powers and parts of the Middle East. So the mandate is the red area there, including the Palestine mandate. And this is probably something that you know. So what do I mean by a four-state solution after 1920? I have in mind the three mandates, Palestine one of them, and also the area of Arabia. I mean, it is not even called yet Saudi Arabia, it is Hashemite Arabia, because at that time the Saudis don't control the area yet. But of course, Arabia was not subject to any mandate arrangement. It gained its independence immediately as a consequence of the collaboration of Sharif Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashemi with the British Empire, the Hussein McMahon exchange. So in a way, what I'm suggesting to students, here you have a four-state solution that came into existence after 1919 in relation to what used to be Ottoman Palestine. But then again, I mean, after 1922, we already speak about a five-state solution in a way, right? Because as you probably know, I'm not going to spend too much time over it. 2/3 of the territory that was supposed to constitute the British mandate over Palestine was sliced away, and the Transjordan came into existence, and then we are left with this 28,000 square meter territory that comprises mandatory Palestine between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Sometimes when you see demonstrations, or I mean, people refer to this territory as historic Palestine, or pro-Zionist or pro-Israelis talk about historic Eretz Israel. From the perspective of comparativists, what we discuss here, of course, is I even in two articles, I think in the 10 years ago, I used the phrase Churchillian cage. It's a cage because it's such a small territory, and you know that it came into existence after 1921, after the Cairo conference. But of course, when we are sucked now into the question of Palestine itself, we are narrowing and zooming into the territory, this very small territory. But what I suggest is that when comparatives do this exercise to zoom in, right, remember that Palestine is part of the world. Palestine is not exceptional. The processes that take place there are quite similar in comparative terms to processes that take place elsewhere. And I always, I mean, view it from a comparative perspective and place this little place that interests us so much and attracts so much attention. Here it is. I don't even need to move. It's not necessarily the center of the world. Some people even discuss it as if it is the center of the Milky Way, right? But it's not, right? That's what it is. And that's how it should be understood in comparative terms. So now a few more words about the difference between historians and comparativists. And here's a quote by John Bruley, who's an emeritus professor in London. He says, "The danger of untheorized history is that it either smuggles in unacknowledged definitions and concepts or substitutes ill-focused narrative for clear analytical description and explanation." He further says, "Theory which cannot be used in historical work is valueless," right? "Historical work which is not theoretically informed is pointless." I always, when I read this 1996 quote, I think, wow, how is it possible that a British professor spoke in such strong terms? Because the Brits are usually known for their understatement, but otherwise, I mean, I think, I mean, he could have probably expressed these tensions between historians and comparativists in softer words, but probably you understand what he is saying. So everything that we say is theoretically informed. For example, if someone says that the Jews in mandatory Palestine comprise 50% of the, or in Tel Aviv, there were 2,000 communist Jews, right? Presumably it's an empirical description, but it is not, because if you look outside your windows, out there, there's no such thing that is called 3, 4, 5, or 2,000. Well, it's a concept. The number is the concept. So even when one says that the Communist Party in Egypt included 200 Jews, this is a statement, an empirical statement that is informed by conceptual thinking of of something that doesn't exist empirically out there, and this is the number 100. So that's what I think Bruley is trying to say, that sometimes historians think that they do not use analytical description, concepts, and explanation, and actually they do. And I subscribe to his view. My talk today is informed by, it's a continuation of something that I did 15 years ago. And in some respects, this current project that I'm presenting is, I waited 15 years and then and now I'm trying to develop it a little bit more. So it's a piece that was published called Palestine, Arabized Jews, and the elusive consequence of Jewish and Arab national formation. Here, of course, I did study the Middle East in general, not only Palestine, but also Egypt and Iraq. But I just want to read something there. I'm sorry that it's a bit blurry. That's what I argued during the introduction. Scholars of nationalism in the Middle East and or of the Arab-Israeli conflict have yet to examine comprehensively the proposition that when Britain issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, there was little inevitable about the subsequent post-1948 outcome of the struggle between Jewish and Arab nationalisms, nor about the respective internal socio-political composition. The socio-political dynamics during the first half of the 20th century between the emerging Arab and Jewish collectivities, which produced the less puzzling post-1948 Middle East, which is not as puzzling as the period we study. So the dynamics have rarely been conceptualized in a non-teleological manner. They have customarily been studied in a narrative historical form unilaterally, as if they naturally or inextricably work their way towards a preordained conflictual future. So this is a description in 2007 of the state of scholarship according to my reading. And I continue from the disciplinary vantage point of comparative politics. I wish to propose that at the beginning of the Zionist-Arab conflict, 1917-1923, several competing bases of potential sociopolitical collectivity were simultaneously present in the Middle East, including lingual, ethnic, civic, religious, primordial, regional, national, or class. Therefore, it is beneficial to probe the dynamics between the Jewish and Arab nationalism in a relational and non-teleological manner, namely as contingent outcome of specific political processes and interactions. So you can see that the word contingent is already present in this piece, contingent. So, and this is what I'm going to do here in the next 20, 30 minutes. Applying more to the mandate. So we speak about the mandate dual commitment. That's the title of the gathering today. Dual commitment for what, I ask? So I suggest that one lens to look at it is to say that it's a dual commitment to secure individual and collective rights for Jews, right? That's the main objective of the mandate. And at the same time, only individual rights to Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, all those collectivities that are non-mentioned in the text of the non-Jew, in the text of the mandate. You can find these words, and they refer to the non-Jewish majority population in Arab Palestine during the time. So what I'm suggesting to you, let's use the lens of collective and individual rights to make sense of everything that is going on during the period that we discuss, and in my view, also later on, all the way to the present, by the way. Right, so I brought the Balfour Declaration, although of course our course or your course starts in 1923. So the Balfour Declaration is ingrained, so to speak, into the text of the mandate. So I'm just using it because it is part of the mandate. this is what Avi Schleim, Professor Avi Schleim says about the Balfour Declaration, but also about the mandate, because the Balfour Declaration is part of the mandate. It is cited there verbatim. So that's what Avi Schleim says from Oxford. The statement, the Balfour Declaration, was exceedingly brief, but its consequences were profound and pervasive. And its impact on the subsequent history of the Middle East was nothing less than a revolutionary. It completely transformed the position of the fledgling Zionist movement vis-a-vis the Arabs of Palestine. And then he says, Avi, a good friend, rarely in the annals of the British Empire has such a short document produced far-reaching consequences. So that's a direct citation from Avi in 2005. Let's read another citation by an equally prominent scholar of the period that we discussed, Rashid Khalidi, Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University, my alma mater. So that's what Rashid is arguing. Great Britain threw its weight of the greatest power of the age, one which was at that moment in the process of conquering Palestine, behind the creation of a Jewish state, he says. Interesting, although the word state is not mentioned in the mandate, as you know. The creation of a Jewish state in what was then an overwhelmingly Arab country against the wishes of its inhabitants. Everything that has followed until this day, says Rashid in 2005, in that conflict-riven land has followed inevitably from this basic decision. So these are the two quotes, and I want to suggest that these two quotations strike me as teleological reasoning. And now, sorry for the historians, what is teleology? Teleology is an explanation for an X as a function of its end or purpose or goal, as opposed to a function of its cause. And I want to tell you that in some respects, this is what transpires in the study of the period that we discuss, teleological arguments. And I wonder, in this respect, is the notion of historical contingency lost on Palestine-Israel studies? Another wonder, is it worthwhile to try and account for post-1923 paths not taken, right? Paths that were not realized. And the mandate, can it be subjected to an anti-teleological consideration? Is it possible to do that? I'm not sure, but I will try by saying that every political outcome is neither random nor teleologically preordained. Things don't just randomly happen. The vote for Brexit didn't randomly happen, but also it was not theologically preordained. It came as a consequence of a contingency. What does it mean, contingency? That in hindsight, past seemed to enroll in a linear storyline, yet this was not the case for those who lived through it. Our 1920s ancestors were living in their present, and thus the future 1947, 1948 outcomes were unknown to them, perhaps unlike to Schleim and Khalidi. I mean, I think that's the issue, that in many respects, Khalidi and Schleim provide us an explanation of the Balfour Declaration based on the outcome, right? Then they come and tell us something in reverse, so to speak. But of course, there was 25 years between the mandate and the 1947. If I ask you, for example, what's going to happen in relation to Brexit in 25 years, can you know? Of course you don't know. Nobody knows, because there are few options for what's going to happen, and that's how one should approach also 1923 onwards. Why is it important? Because the mandate did not lay precise configuration for its envisioned Jewish national home, did not do it. Jewish state is not mentioned in the text of the mandate, notwithstanding the fact that there were some Zionists that tried to inject stronger concepts into earlier drafts of both the Balfour Declaration and the mandate. They wanted it to include the phrase Jewish state, but it did not. The reason that it is not included is probably cautioned by the League of Nations and the British Empire, kind of an awareness that prospects were slim for the mandate to be viewed favorably by Arab Palestinians or non-Palestinians. So therefore, it's not there. My proposition here is simply that the 2,037 words that comprise the stipulation of the mandate, if you think about an essay that you're writing, 3,000 words, that's the length of the text. The 2,700 words did leave enough open space for the principal potentiality of the Jewish national home to assume a sub-state configuration. So when Khalidi mentions a Jewish state, it was not necessarily an inevitable, he uses the word inevitable outcome of the mandate. And let me say the same thing when a comparatives now is going to utilize 2022 terminology. Nowadays, people speak about alternative to partition. You know, the Israeli state colonized the West Bank completely, sent 500 violent settlers into the West Bank, and people say, well, you can no longer partition the territory, so people now speak about alternatives to partition. That's the big issue now. So what I'm suggesting, actually, I mean, you know, this presumably new phrases of the 21st century entirely built into the mandate as a possible contingencies. I mean, alternative to partition was there all the time from day one. So the problem is, and I think that this also refers to the two quotations from Avi Shlam and Rashid Khalidi, saturated with teleological reasoning and rationalization. Both Zionist and anti-Zionist historiographies have exhibited insufficient patience to discuss post-1923 reasons that might have underlined such sub-state paths not taken. State that would secure a Jewish national home and maybe Palestinian rights in a sub-state configuration, not through a Jewish state or a Palestinian state. And let me now try to illustrate that visually. I know we are all historians and comparativists. We're not from the Department of Art, but let's try and envision something different, another outcome. So for example, take this flag. It doesn't exist, right? There's no such flag in the world, right? But what I'm suggesting here that if you read the mandate, such possible flag could have come into existence. I mean, it was not inevitable that we would have the Israeli flag and the Palestinian flag and the notion of two separate states. It was not built in inevitably into the mandate. Let's take another flag that doesn't exist in the world, and you can see another something that could have come out of the mandate as it is phrased, right, and reconciled differently individual and collective rights of both Palestinian Arabs and Zionist Jews or Jews in the territory. I'm going further. Here, another flag that does not exist. There's no flag, but I mean, what I'm again suggesting is such a depiction of reconciliation between individual and collective rights of the two community could have come into existence, and by the way, can still come in the future. This is why it is important. And I'm going on and on with more illustration, visual illustrations that depict potential possibilities that were present in my understanding as a comparativist in the text of the mandate. And we're going on and on. Here is another one that actually throws in a little bit the three religions of the place. Before we spoke only about Jews and Muslims usually. So, you know, why don't we have a flag that conceptualizing interreligious groups in a different way that does not rest on the notion of partition and two states. So again, this was potential pathways that did exist at the time. What I suggest is that mainstream Palestinian nationalism and separatist Jewish Zionists shrugged off alternatives or contingent proposal to secure individual and collective rights in some sub-state configuration. So paths not taken, parts, historical parts that were not realized empirically, but were present. For example, a lot of suggestions, there's a lot of primary sources. We did a lot of work about it all the way into the 1920s. After the mandate was established, there were many Palestinian Jews that were native to Palestine, such as myself, by the way, Chaim Ben Kiki, Yosef Kastel, and other Palestinian Jews that said all the time, you need to revise and resubmit the Balfour Declaration that is included in the mandate. Why? Because it frustrates the collective rights of Palestinian Arabs in the territory and takes care only of their individual rights. And instead, you need to envision a shared homeland between everybody. So don't speak about a Jewish national home, speak about a shared homeland. This is a contingency, right? You probably know about Brit Shalom, the German Jews, very sophisticated people, most of them German, that envisioned a binational state that is not a Jewish state, of course, a binational state. It's also not a liberal state, but what I'm suggesting that both of these contingencies, a shared homeland and a binational state, were dismissed by mainstream, by Zionists and also by Palestinians. So both of these constituencies did not consider seriously this different pathway to reconcile individual and collective rights. Right, and then because it didn't work, in 1937, the British, following 15 years of efforts there to try and deliver this dual mandate, they thought that it's not possible. They came up for the first time with the concept of partition, and for the first time, a global power used the phrase a Jewish state. I'm skipping here because that's not what I'm discussing, and you know that, right? I'm going to just say that partition was entertained for a fleeting moment, in a way, in my reading of the pre-1947 period. It was entertained between July 1937, the Peel Report, to October 1938, where the Woodhead Report, 400-page report, both of them are 400 pages long, concluded that you can't partition the territory. And of course, after the publication of the Peel Report and the transformation of the Palestinian nonviolent resistance in the form of a general strike into an armed, outright anti-colonial uprising, the idea of partition faded away. And it's interesting because everybody speaks so much about partition. What I'm suggesting here, actually, most of the time during the British mandate, partition was not the dominant option there. It was a minority moment that partition was entertained. And it's interesting that the notion of partition occupies our thinking so much. Of course, the situation is different in 48. But I'm now saying, okay, so let's look again into the 1939 MacDonald White Paper. His Majesty's government believes that the framers of the 1922 mandate, in which the 1917 Balfour Declaration was embodied, could not have intended that Palestine should be converted into a Jewish state against the will of the Arab population of the country. So immediately something different. So what is the White Paper of 1939? Disclaims the short-lived intentions to establish a Jewish state from July 1937, restricts Jewish migration to the territory to produce a total of 600,000 Jews for sure, and most importantly, the White Paper of 1939 envisions a single unitary Arab state within a 10-year period that would embody inside it a non-statist Jewish national home. So 1939 represents a different model, right, that was not realized in some respects. A single Arab state that will include inside it a non-stated Jewish national home. I don't know, sometimes when I speak to my students, I say, you know, maybe they had in mind something like Wales, for example. I don't know, like a Wales home of sorts, right, that is a sort of a state, but still enjoys some cultural, lingual, and other rights. Maybe that's what they had in mind. But this is not partition. That's the important issue here. And the issue is that the Zionists, of course, opposed the idea because from their perspective, it reversed the promises of the mandate to establish an explicitly Jewish state. Of course, there was no promise to deliver a state. So never mind, the Zionists opposed, but also the Palestinians opposed this possibility because the white paper neither granted them immediate independence nor blocked Jewish migration completely and at once. So there was the mainstream Palestinian leadership rejected the possibility of establishing a unitary Arab state that includes a Jewish national home. Comparativists just bear in mind that in 1939, at the time that all of this takes place, many countries did not yet enjoy full independence, so Palestine is not an exception. And these states include India, Algeria, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and almost all the countries in Asia and Africa. So that's the issue in 1939, when the proposal is rejected by both Zionist and Palestinian nationalists. I should only mention that it was not the case that all Palestinians opposed the proposal, the British proposal for a single Arab state with a Jewish national home. But this contingency in 1939 was deemed appeasing or collaborationist with Zionism. And in a way, people who subscribed, Palestinian Arabs who subscribed or supported the 1939 white paper were sidelined and were even considered a little bit as some people that are too much appeased Zionism. So it didn't work, but they were there. There were other parts that were not taken in the 1940s, a liberal binationalism that was proposed by the people that re-established in the 1940 Brit Shalom, the Union Party, the Union, one union rather than partition and states. So it was a liberal binationalism. In the 1940s, there were also a lot of Marxist group on the ground in Palestine that began to entertain binational schemes. They already deemed from a Marxist perspective that the composition of the society in Palestine assumed a binational character, and therefore a binational scheme is possible. And there were other attempts in the mid-1940s to reconcile individual and collective rights of both Jews and Palestinian Arabs in a way that avoids partition. I'm not going to discuss it. I'm concluding here, and I'm sorry if I took too much time. I want to say a few words about a 1947 alternative, another contingency that is really not discussed enough by scholars of the mandate, which is very surprising in my view. Remember that when Britain handed the question of Palestine to the General Assembly sent a committee of 11 member states to investigate the question of Palestine, UNSCOP, or United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. They did their work, worked 4 years, did primary research, interviewed, and then the recommendations were split. Not all members, the 11 members, could agree on one alternative. And the minority proposal that was offered by Yugoslavia, Iran, and India, as opposed to the 7 other states that supported partition that later became the United Nations Resolution 181, the Australian representative abstained. So that's why we have 7-3 against 10 and 1 abstention. But I'm talking about the minority plan. What did the minority plan offer in 1947, all the way into the General Assembly? To create a single federated state to secure individual and collective rights to the 2 protagonists. So they did not speak about a Jewish state. They did speak about a Jewish national home, but not an independent state within a federation. So again, people forget that the minority plan of Yugoslavia, Iran, and India was rejected outright by Zionists and Palestinians. They, in concert, frustrated this contingency. And of course, it didn't work because there was no support for such a scheme that, in my view, again, squares 100% with the text of the mandate. It does not contradict it. That's why the mandate is kind of interesting in my view. And this is my final slide for today. And I know that I didn't touch a lot of issues. I think a qualification is needed in relation to the discussion of 1947, 1948, because I think that many scholars, including professors, by the way, simply don't fully understand what happened there. We need to remember that the principal Palestinian opposition before 1941 was not to the notion of the partition contingency, the establishment of a Jewish state. And by the way, it didn't matter if it's 55% of Palestine, 10% of Palestine. Jewish state, of course, was not going to be tolerated. To surrender part of the Arab homeland to a state that is Jewish, that's not a problem. But the opposition was not to the partition, to establishment of a Jewish state. It was an opposition to the notion of granting collective rights to Jews in mandatory Palestine, even in a sub-state configuration. That's the issue that is more interesting and should bother or that should be discussed much more by Rashid and Avi. I mean, the fact that in 1917 and in 1939, white paper, and in 1947, there were options, viable options to not to establish a Jewish state, but to establish a joint state that secure individual and collective rights in a manner that does not include a separatist state. Why is all of this discussion relevant? Because everything that we discussed now about the mandate is relevant to this morning, 2022. Because the discussion, okay, so you discuss alternatives to partition in 2022, you discuss one state, two state debate. I mean, that's what is going on there, right? That's the discussion. And in many respects, I suggest to students, if you understand properly the moments of 1939 and 1947, you will be able to comprehend better the issue today. And who knows, maybe in 25 years from now, because again, it's a contingency, right? We can even reintroduce the coin that prevailed in 1947. Maybe we can reinvent the space between the river and the sea again. And we have a coin that does say Palestine, does say Palestine in English, does say Palestina, Eretz Israel, or Land of Israel in Hebrew, does include numerical, regular 1927 number, but Arabic numbers too. And what you see here, again, you see a visualization of another contingency that existed back then, but also exists today in relation to the future. Sorry that I could do it only in very brief notes. Thank you very much. Joshua, you're taking control over the discussion, right?
Yes, that's right. We have a question here. It says, what would have happened to Palestine if there had been no Cold War, or if at least it began 5 years later? In that case, Britain would not have been so concerned about US government's opinion and could have imposed their own vision. And without the Cold War, would Britain have been so concerned about alienating the governments of Arab states?
That's a good one, and I'm quite, yeah, I mean, I'm taken by surprise, and it's good. So, I mean, I'm not going to, okay, of course, that Britain took a so-called neutral position. It abstained in all the votes around, because presumably the British Empire wanted both sides to agree on everything before it involves. But I mean, I must say that that at least the Soviet position in 1947, I deem it. I don't think that the discussion is if Stalin and the Soviet Union so-called betrayed the Palestinian people. I don't think it's a helpful explanation in relation to what happened. I think that if you see the Soviets, of course, supported partition simply because they wanted the British out. and there were even some Marxists in the region, not too many, mostly in Egypt, that supported the notion of partition as a first step, right? Not as an end result. Let the colonial power depart, have two small states, but it's not the end of the affair. And the other thing is that at that point in time, I think that from a Marxist perspective, and not necessarily a Stalinist perspective, a Marxist perspective, right? I think that Marxists, when they view the composition of the society on the ground in mandatory Palestine, 32% minority group, 32% it's not a minority. It's almost a binational composition of the society. Whether one likes it or not, it's a different matter, right? I mean, think about the French in Algeria. They were 14%. Whites in South Africa, 20%. Kurds in Turkey, as today, 14%. Non-whites in the UK, 10%. So I'm talking about 33% community that is linguistically a little bit different, religiously different. So that's, I think that from a Marxist perspective, Marxists could begin to see the formation of a national collectivity. And this is why they said, okay, we need to recognize that. But the reason, I don't know. I mean, the question is, what was the view of the British? And I think James, if he's here, I'm not sure, will be more equipped to give an authoritative answer to the question. I would love to hear him, because why waste my own energy when someone that knows more can join? Yes, the second question, no, a partition of the territory could not be imposed because I mean, partition could not be tolerated from a Palestinian perspective. In 1949, 47, I mean, you cannot surrender, you know, of course, not 55% of the territory to a community of recent immigrants into the territory. So to surrender it for an independent state, I don't think it would have happened. But the more interesting issue from my perspective is not the opposition to partition, but the opposition for a federative state. That's more important. So, for example, when Haj Amin al-Husseini in 1947 opposes the possibility of a federation, right? I mean, he has very good reasons to do it, right? Very good reasons, right? But maybe, but in many respects, I mean, I can understand him. The issue, what I'm suggesting to you, is that the opposition for binationalism or opposition to granting collective rights even to Israeli Jews today is not a prevailing case in relation to discussion of Palestine. It's a minority view. So that's why this intrigues me, the issue about collective rights for both communities. But partition wouldn't have worked back then, and unfortunately, and properly cannot work today. You believe it is not, what was the form of cantonization of federalization since could be into a partition? Yeah, I mean, very good. Another anonymous attendee. I mean, the reason that Palestinian Arabs in 1947 opposed to the minority plan, to the option contingency of federation, was the fact that they saw it as partition by other means. Partition by other means, but I think that they overread probably the issue, because if you read the minority plan, I think that it was not the case, and the federation did not mean a Jewish state. It meant a federative state, and a federative state is not there's a huge difference between a federation and two states. It's not the same thing at all. If you think about federations, I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry that it's a bit simplistic, but think of the relation between San Francisco and New York in the Federation of the United States of America. So of course, it's not two states. I mean, it's a federation. If you you are accredited to practice as a lawyer in New York, you can do it only in New York. If you move to the East Coast, of course you need to do some process to get accreditation, but it's not two states. So it's I don't think that the interpretation of the federation as partitioned by other means was correct. Okay, I see some chats here. Yeah, maybe it's a little bit hard for me to follow the chat because I'm also. So, Josh, if you can help me something, if I miss something, if there's anything else that people wish to.
What if Palestine became independent at the same time as Iraq in 1932?
That's a good one. First of all, Iraq was nominally independent in 1932, so it's not completely correct to call it independence. The British were still there, the British army, the British bureaucrats, administrators, so it's a nominal independence. But what I am trying to convey today is that the issue is not so much about independence and the creation of a nation state, right? This is the discussion that dominates the discussion over Palestine, Israel. I think that also in relation to the period that interests us up to 1948, but I think also later. What I suggest is that the issue here, whether in 1932 there was an alternative way to secure individual and collective rights to the two groups. Of course, in 1932, the balance between the two groups was a little bit different, although I think that probably Jews comprise, what, 23% of the population in 1932? I can't recall right now. So the issue is not about independence. The issue about in my reading, right, is the issue about, is it possible to reconcile individual and collective rights in a manner that does not require a state, right? And once again, look elsewhere. I mean, you can see it. You can see it in Scotland. You can see it in the Basque Country. You can see it in Catalonia. You can see it maybe in the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, how can one in Belgium? How can you reconcile collective rights, right, without necessarily thinking in the direction of a separatist nation state? So that's the issue. I mean, I think the issue that, so I would ask the question in these terms in relation to 1932. I suspect that it was harder to do it in 1932 when compared to 1939 because of the changed demographies on the ground in Palestine at that time. By the end of the 1930s, Jews comprise 29.9% of the population. It's a huge, huge minority group, huge. Anyone else?
No, that seems to be it all. Thank you, Dr. Behar, for your wonderful lecture and discussion, and we'll just take a few moments break now.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for having me, and we'll see you later.
See ya.
Bye.